Now I'd like to welcome to the show Brian Hawkins, Senior Director of External Affairs at People United for Privacy. Welcome to Free the Economy, Brian.
Thank you, Richard, for having me.
So, just to start, give us a short pitch on what People United for Privacy does and why you think it really matters.
Yeah, People United for Privacy, we're a nonprofit organization. We are dedicated to protecting the right to privately give to causes you believe in. We aspire to be your go-to source for all issues related to donor privacy. So our team is unique, is that we are comprised of functional experts on all issues of all disciplines related to donor privacy. So policy, government affairs, legal, communications, coalitions. If you ever have a donor privacy related question, we are your go-to resource.
All right, excellent. Now, I really like the phrase, especially that the organization puts front and center on your website. It's the first thing people see. It says, "Transparency is for government, privacy is for people." Why is that distinction so important?
Yeah, it's important because so many of our opponents use the term transparency in order to justify their disclosure initiatives. And as the quote says, we believe in transparency absolutely for government and holding government officials accountable. But where private citizens donate to causes they believe in, the organizations they believe in, that's private. And I'll talk through this later on as we chat, but um, yeah, the right the U.S. Supreme Court has consistently affirmed the right to privately donate. Our founders, during the earliest days of the American Revolution, fighting for our freedom, relied on anonymous giving to their advocacy. So this is a fundamental American principle that we are committed to protecting.
All right. Now I know the current legal status quo on both political and nonprofit donations is we've seen a lot of debate, certainly since the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. That doesn't seem that long ago to me, but it was all the way back in 2010, so I'm sure it's long ago to some people. Um, but like you said, this question of donor privacy goes way, way back in American history. Like you said, all the way back to people supporting causes privately in the like Revolutionary era, but we've also got some high profile Supreme Court cases like NAACP versus Alabama in 1958. And I think that's one that I think a lot of people can relate to. Can you give us some background on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll walk through some of the legal precedent that gets us to where we're at today. So, yeah, NAACP versus Alabama, you mentioned, starts off in the height of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, where activists across the Deep South were fighting to overthrow the Jim Crow regime. So the local chapter of the Alabama's NAACP was one of those organizations organizing lots of protest and activism against Jim Crow. And obviously in the Jim Crow South at the time, the Attorney General of Alabama was not pleased with the local chapter of the NAACP. So he wanted to expose their donors. So he pursued some legal action to compel them to disclose their donors. And of course, disclosing their donors at this tense moment of American politics would have been quite significant to the civil rights movement at the time. So the NAACP appealed the mandate to disclose their donors and ultimately went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court, in a series of cases, affirmed that anonymous giving, private giving is constitutionally protected speech and that the NAACP had a right to keep their donors private. So for the longest time, that was the fundamental case law of donor privacy rights. And it was affirmed recently in the case of Americans for Prosperity Foundation v. Bonta, Bonta being the Attorney General of California. Now, this case stemmed back also, like you mentioned, like 10 years before, where prior AG of California, a familiar name, Kamala Harris, went after the donors of Americans for Prosperity Foundation. So AFPF sued to prevent their donors from being disclosed. And actually, let me back up. California was awful with protecting the donor list of nonprofit organizations. So the AG's office had accidentally published the donor list on their website, and like these donor lists were supposed to be held private, but yeah, it was published on their website, and the donor lists were leaking, just all types of just impropriety that the AG's office had with containing or protecting donor lists. So AFPF sued, went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and again, 2 years ago, the Supreme Court once again affirmed that private giving is constitutionally protected speech and gave California quite the slap on the wrist. So that's where we're at now. We've had multiple U.S. Supreme Court cases affirming that your ability to privately give is a First Amendment right.
Yeah, in that case, in certain cases, you have an expectation that some of this information will be made completely public. But in the California case, they supposedly the information was only going to go to the Attorney General's office. Excuse me, was only going to go to state government officials, and only they were going to be able to see it. But California was either
negligent,
not very good at keeping it private, or maybe someone was not operating in good faith about intentionally leaking it. But that's another case where another situation where the privacy mandates from the government, as opposed to guarantees for citizens, but requirements where you remit information to the government, are only as strong as the ability of and your ability to trust the government will actually keep that information private. And as we've seen, there have been plenty of cases where that has not happened.
Yeah, there's been multiple issues. I mean, one thing to clarify, which our opponents are try to confuse, is like there's a distinct difference between giving to nonprofit organizations that do issue education, CEI, People United for Privacy. With C3 organizations, we educate the public, we educate policymakers on issues that we care about. That's not political. Then there is express political activity, that is actively donating to a political campaign who advocates for the election or defeat of candidates. And that is where the Supreme Court has ruled that disclosure is required. And there's a whole case law around that, basically asserting that we need to disclose that information in order to prevent the appearance of quid pro quo corruption. So we need to know who's donating directly to political campaigns, and that's fine. We try not to work on that issue, but so many of our opponents try to melt them. They'll expand what constitutes political giving. They'll expand the definition of political in order to broaden what type of organizations need to disclose their donors. So that's one thing to clarify here, is that we need to draw a really strong line between what constitutes political and non-political organizations. And of course, that determines what type of organizations are required to disclose. Now, sorry, I'm going to give a long-winded answer here. I get excited talking about these issues. But going back to government safeguarding of this donor information, and yes, to your point, no matter what type of personal information is disclosed to the government, there are so many instances of the government either accidentally leaking, intentionally leaking, or just being absolutely negligent with very sensitive personal information. So one example is Representative Joaquin Castro. He was up in a tiff on something on Twitter one day. He decided to tweet all the people in his district who had donated to President Trump's political campaign. Now, once again, that's public information. It was direct political spending, but to put it out on a tweet was really a call. It's a very subtle wink and a nod call to action for people to come harass these donors. And that's exactly what happened. And these people who were donating, they weren't significant donors. These are people who were just small business owners. There was a public school teacher, and they faced all types of harassment after that tweet. There's businesses that had the activists would come over to their facilities and vandalize and harass employees. So another instance in my long-winded tangent here, but another example, again, California. Last summer, California leaked applicants to concealed carry weapons permits. So, in order to get a CCW in California, you need to file an application. It has a lot of sensitive information, your home address, and other personally identifying information. But all of that information leaked. This is supposed to be private information between you and the government, so you can exercise the Second Amendment right. But the state of California leaked that information. So all of that just, again, demonstrates that even when information is supposed to be properly submitted to the government in so many instances are absolutely careless and are making people vulnerable by having their sensitive information disclosed to the public.
Yeah, it definitely seems like one way to stop that from happening again is not have the government have the right to collect as much information in the first place.
Yes, absolutely.
And so some of this information, the more detailed information, like you said, there's the explicitly political stuff when you donate to a campaign that is governed by the Federal Election Commission, and then the donations, really more what we're talking about here, donations to nonprofit organizations, educational charitable groups, what we call 501c3. That's the part of the legal code that guides how the Internal Revenue Service treats you when you don't have to pay taxes like if you were a corporation. So sometimes we say that in conversations in DC Beltway people C3 C4, so the 501c3s are the most of what people think of as nonprofit groups, but there's even problems there, right? So there's issues with kind of weaponizing that information for people who donate to political campaigns, but even when it comes to the sort of not explicitly political kind of C3 nonprofit groups, there's the case, many years ago. Again, to me, it doesn't seem that long ago, but there was a sort of IRS bureaucrat named Lois Lerner back during the Tea Party days when the Tea Party movement was a big thing. And she was accused of sort of slow rolling these certifications when conservative groups would apply. You have to apply to the IRS and say, please recognize us as one of these tax exempt C3 organizations. And supposedly she didn't like their politics and so wasn't granting them that certification. And that's something that's supposed to just happen automatically. The IRS isn't supposed to judge whether you're good enough or your politics are correct. That's something you're supposed to just file a form for. But and so Republicans in Congress became quite up in arms in this, and it was like quite a scandal at the time back in 2010 or so. But the question is, we found out about that, right? We know not only that it happened, we know the name of a particular person who worked at the IRS who was responsible. How many times has this happened and we never hear about it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's trying to prove the dog that didn't bark here. And that's one of the issues we have in this space. There's a couple layers. I remember, one, in a lot of the litigation on this issue, we discussed the chilling effect of the disclosure regime, or even the threat of disclosure here. And I hear this so often when I chat with donors, and of course, they never want to come out and say it because the fact that they're mentioning this indicates their value for privacy. But they're like, no, we're afraid that if we donate to a certain organization or just cause that we believe in personally, that we're going to be subject to all types of harassment, intimidation from opponents and activists. For example, I have one example. I have a friend who used to work in this conservative think tank world, and his family owned a series of restaurants in a major East Coast city, left-leaning, Democratic-dominated city. And this friend was so paranoid that one day locals in this city would learn about where he works, and end up targeting his family business. Now, so eventually he just kind of quit the conservative think tank world, went to go work for the family business, just because that paranoia and that threat was too significant. And he wasn't working on a controversial issue. It's just, this is the reality of the world we live in, where your giving and your political beliefs can be exposed and your career threatened because of that. So yeah, the chilling effect is real and tangible.
You know, so a lot of this is an issue that where it plays out at the federal level, like we said, like the Federal Election Commission or the IRS policy. But like as we were saying earlier, like in the state of California and some of these other state AG's offices, it's also a question of state policy. Which states are on your radar screen these days, whether for good developments or troubling ones? I think I saw some stuff recently with in Alabama and New York State.
Yeah, taking notes here. Let's start with the good, Alabama. So, I mentioned the NAACP versus Alabama case from what is it, 70 years ago now? But just last week, Alabama became the 17th state to pass the Personal Privacy Protection Act. The PPPA is our model legislation that basically says state agencies are prohibited from compelling the disclosure of donors and members of nonprofit organizations. So state agency X cannot come to your organization and say, "Hey, give us your donor list or give us your member list." This law prohibits them from doing that. So it's been passed in 17 states so far, and Alabama just became state number 17 last week. And it was a really special moment for us for a few reasons. One, obviously mentioning NAACP Alabama from 70 years ago, to now have the state on the record protecting the rights of groups to advocate and for people to donate to causes they believe in without the threat of government coming in and harassing and intimidating them. It's a beautiful full circle moment to see happen in that state. Another layer why it was really special is that really demonstrating the significance here is that it passed both chambers unanimously, Republican and Democrat support. And we've had this model pass, one chamber unanimously when we passed it in the states, but this one passed both chambers. That was really a proud moment for us. And the third reason why this bill was so special for us was that it's our first time passing this bill when it's been sponsored by a Democrat. We've had this bill signed by Democratic governors in Kansas and Louisiana, but this was the first time a Democrat actually sponsored this bill. So it really demonstrates the broad bipartisan support that that privacy brings. That it isn't an exclusively center right issue, even though sometimes it's tempting to think that way. I'll note that when we work in the states here, we've had the local chapters of the ACLU come in and support it, and obviously here the NAACP come in and support it. In the Supreme Court case, AFPF v. Bonta, Chief Justice Roberts, who wrote the majority opinion, he noted in the brief, in his ruling, he said, "Wow, there's so many groups across the ideological spectrum who are coming in support of AFPF here. The Human Rights Campaign, ACLU, NAACP, CARE, the Council for American Islamic Relations, is that right? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, all the center-right groups. So this is a bipartisan issue, and that's the good news here. The bad news is the threats persist. There's still threats. It's funny, we have all these significant wins, to include the Supreme Court affirming the right to privately donate, but still enemies of free speech are still out there trying to see, well, maybe we can get away with this. And most recently in New York, so after AFPF ruling, with the Supreme Court ruled that anonymous giving is First Amendment speech and you can't just mass collect donor lists, a few states still have a database of donor lists: New York, New Jersey, and California. So they stopped collecting, but they still have all those records on file. Well, in New York, the AG's office, again, it's always the AG's, the AG's office again leaked donor information from a nonprofit affiliated with Nikki Haley, who of course is running for president now, but her nonprofit, Stand for America, Inc., had their donor list accidentally leaked by the AG's office. And Empire Center, did an investigation, and what they ultimately learned is that New York still had this vast database of of donor information, which, as we mentioned earlier, the government having that information, whether they publicly disclose it or not, is a threat within itself. So Empire Center of New York is filing, which is an SPN affiliated group, is filing a lawsuit against the state of New York, basically saying you guys need to delete that database of information. So they just filed that a week ago. So we'll see. We'll see how that one goes.
That'll be a great one to watch. And we should mention the Empire Center nonprofit, a public policy nonprofit in New York State, is a part of the State Policy Network, or SPN. I'm the acronym explainer on this show.
Okay.
And so there's so the State Policy Network is a group of state-based think tanks and advocacy groups that and I think these days they have at least one in every single state in the country. For I think it was episode 17, we had Brooke Medina of the John Locke Foundation, which is down in North Carolina. It's one of those state policy network groups. So we think they are doing great work around the country. Now, Brian, I know that we've covered a lot of good reasons why people should be concerned about this issue and why First Amendment protections for donor privacy are important. But I think we still have a lot of people who aren't kind of read into the issue and don't know a lot of the background, still think that expecting charitable donations to be disclosed the way explicitly political ones are is probably not that big of a deal, because we live in a mostly peaceful and mostly politically stable country, right? Compared to some others. And especially sort of like you alluded to before, there's this sort of kind of ideological polarization where some people think that if you're on the left side of the political spectrum, you should be for forced disclosure of everyone, and that it's only people on the center right that care about this as a donor privacy issue. But I would wonder what the same people would think if they kind of put themselves in a different position and didn't think about living here in the United States, a mostly peaceful and stable place. But what if it was, peace activists in Russia wanted to, keep their donations private, or, like secular reformers who live in Iran, or gay rights activists in Uganda, or pick your choice of besieged political group. I think hopefully it won't need to get to the point of the United States being as dangerous as some of those places in order for people to make this connection. But I think it would be a lot easier for some people to understand the importance if you look at some of these other countries, authoritarian regimes. If you expected people who are activists in those places to disclose their donor information, well, all their supporters would be arrested tomorrow.
Yes, it's very fitting. So we actually have a story that epitomizes that threat exactly. On our website, you can view this on our YouTube video. Dr. Jianli Yang, he's a mathematics professor from China. He was at Tiananmen Square. He's been a vocal critic of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP's authoritarian regime. His activism landed him in a Chinese CCP prison for 5 years. He got out and fled to the US, where he's at now. And here in the US, he runs a nonprofit Citizens Power Initiative that advocates for democracy in China. But of course, the CCP can see his donor list, or at least before we've had a lot of this reforms. Excuse me. So his donors are under surveillance and threat, harassment, intimidation from the CCP. So he's starved for funding. He is trying to advocate for democracy in his home country. And if you meet him, this wonderful, wonderful man. And one thing that stood out to me when I met him, he and I spoke on a panel together once, is how much he loves his country. Like, he loves China, he loves home, and all he wants to do is go back home. And in our video, you see, he gets emotional thinking about his family who's still home, and he just wants to go home, but he can't go home because it's an authoritarian regime. He's advocating for that regime change, but his activism is threatened and burdened because his donors are under threat, and no one wants to donate to him right now because you incur the wrath of the CCP. So yes, that's an excellent point. Here in the U.S., it's I don't want to minimize it, obviously, but the threat is very different compared to what Dr. Yang has to face. So it really illustrates how U.S. policy has impacts globally for the social activism that to achieve change that we want to see in this world.
Mm-hmm. And so the crossover, like we said, we keep trying to look at these two categories because they're treated differently legally. The political donations that are explicitly political to campaigns that are public, and then the sort of charitable, educational, nonprofit donations that we want to protect the privacy of. There's an interesting kind of almost crossover here when it comes to what some corporations are doing and what activists want us trying to like pressure corporations to do or not to do when it comes to their own donations. So corporations donating to, again, these sort of like, charitable nonprofit groups. There are activists out there who said like, oh, well, if this company donates to this group that we disagree with, then we should boycott them, or that they should be regulated, or companies should be required to make more detailed disclosures the way they haven't been before. And this sort of plays into the sort of ESG movement, the environmental, social, and governance kind of stuff. How's that working?
Yeah, so this is something we've been watching. There hasn't been too many significant developments yet, but we're closely monitoring. But yeah, ESG is increasingly becoming a donor privacy threat. So Climate Action 100 is one of these ESG ratings firms where they evaluate companies and give them an ESG score. And then investors come in and use those scores to determine whether or not they'll invest in them. So under the G, the governance category, Climate Action 100 evaluates companies on their corporate giving to nonprofit organizations. So because corporations that donate to conservative think tanks or are part of right-leaning trade associations will rate negatively on their ESG score. And then additionally, on top of that, they're pressuring companies to disclose most of their giving. Now, as we've already demonstrated here, when these companies disclose their giving, what they're really trying to do is scrutinize them and embarrass them for contributing to conservative causes. And of course, a company just doesn't want that type of scrutiny. They don't want to face that activist pressure. So when the spending is disclosed, it's just going to starve conservative organizations of funding. The SEC, as the Securities and Exchange Commission, as part of their ESG crusade, they've been seeking, and the commissioner, who is it, Gary something?
Oh, Gary Gensler, the current chairman, yeah.
Gensler, yeah. He's on record saying that he wants to pursue rulemaking that would require corporations to disclose contributions to nonprofit organizations. The only thing that's stopping him from doing so is that Congress has forbade the agency from implementing or enacting such rulemaking, but that prohibition is largely through a policy rider that continues to get renewed. So we have a backstop, fortunately, but to be clear, the SEC is trying to do this. They're trying to get corporations to disclose their spending. ESG firms are putting pressure for corporations to disclose their spending, particularly to the right, and using ESG ratings in order to pressure them towards a very negative direction.
Well, yeah, and when it comes to who is interested, who is donating to various causes, I understand the sort of like affiliation where you assume, if you're like, well, this is a person who I don't like very much. I already know them and I know their politics and I don't like them very much, so I'm just going to assume anything they donate to is a bad idea. But people seem worried that, some nefarious billionaire, whether it's, George Soros or Charles Koch or, Michael Bloomberg or whoever, is going to, have improper influence on political affairs. But shouldn't we also just be able to look at policies and ideas and proposals and decide whether they're good or not just on their own merits? Because I wonder, I mean, if you ask people, there's some new law that's proposed, and you ask them what they think about it, is there a law that it would be that when you read it, it's great, it sounds wonderful, and you're really supportive of it, but then secretly it turns out it's terrible because then you find out some rich guy that you've never met supports it that you don't like. I mean, can't we just like evaluate things, whether they're good or not, without knowing which billionaire likes them or hates them?
Yeah, absolutely. I insinuated this earlier on, but going back to the founding era with the Federalist Papers, the writers of the Federalist Papers, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison. The fourth one I'm missing. Ooh, my history professor's going to kill me for this one.
Those three, I think.
Those three, right? All right, good. But no, they all wrote under pseudonyms in order to keep their identities anonymous, because that exact reason. They wanted their ideas front and center for the ideas that they were presenting. They didn't want their identities and their personal lives and politics to get involved. They just wanted the ideas to be the center of the discussion. So yes, that's exactly why anonymity matters. You mentioned like the Kochs and the Soros, and this is a point I make all the time, but the disclosure laws, you're not going to hurt the rich billionaire donors, because trust me, they have very expensive, sophisticated lawyers who know how to keep their giving private. And I know that because I know all these sophisticated lawyers, very smart people. It's the non-billionaires, the non-millionaires, you and I, who just want to give a couple bucks a month or whatever to a cause that we believe in. We're the ones who are going to be hurt. So many of us donate. And one more tangent here, but we've done a lot of polling on this issue. One of the obstacles to public support or a broader acceptance is that a lot of people don't view themselves as donors. When they hear the word donor, once again, they're thinking Charles Koch, George Soros, and other billionaires. But like, if you donate to your church, donate to your local pet shelter, as my wife and I do, you're a donor, and your name could end up on a government list because of what you donate to. And that's what we're trying to protect. We want to make sure that you don't need a fancy lawyer in order to keep your giving private, that you can just do so without fear of the government or anyone coming after you.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you're a billionaire, just set up your own foundation. You don't need to worry about donating $25 a year to the local pet shelter. All right, Brian, this has been excellent, eye-opening, and a lot of really important information. Tell us, where can people find you and People United for Privacy to follow up on this issue out there on the internet?
Yeah, you can Google us, People United for Privacy. Our website is unitedforprivacy.com. You can email me directly, brian@unitedforprivacy.com. We're not hard to find. We love talking about our work. We'd love to be a resource for any of your questions related on this issue. And my role, and I probably should have did the introduction at the top, my role is external affairs. So my role is to bring in partners from anyone who wants to work together on shared objectives. I love finding ways for us to partner and get creative. So reach out to me. I'm always eager to find ways that we can collaborate.
All right, thank you. And just one last reminder, if you would like to donate to the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the producer of this podcast, you can go to cei.org/donate and donate all you want, and it will remain private. All right. Thanks, Brian.
Awesome. Thank you, Richard. I appreciate it.